Last episode, we heard Michel Guillaume Jean de Crèvecoeur's glowing 1782 vision. America as a great asylum where poor Europeans become new men in a melting pot of freedom. But what did that dream actually rest upon? Pages 10 through 40 of our document pull back the curtain. They reveal the brutal foundations of conquest, genocide, and slavery that made the settler society possible, and then show how that same society evolved into today's multinational crossroads. This is the reality behind the idealism. Let's begin. The story of modern America, as it is often told, begins with a foundational myth. It's a story that opens on page 10 of a pivotal text, with a lie that still echoes in the halls of power and the pages of history books today. The lie that this continent was an empty land, a howling wilderness, just waiting for the hand of civilization to tame it. This concept, known in legal terms as nobody's land, was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a deliberate and powerful fiction, a narrative tool crafted to justify the immense violence that was to come. It painted a picture of a vast, unpeopled expanse, erasing the complex societies, the intricate trade routes, the sophisticated agricultural systems, and the deep spiritual connection to the land that had existed for millennia. Before the first European ships made landfall, this was a continent not of emptiness, but of abundance, home to hundreds of distinct nations and cultures. This myth of the empty wilderness was essential. It allowed European settlers to see themselves not as invaders, but as pioneers, not as conquerors, but as creators, bringing light to a dark and vacant world. This idea was so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the national psyche, that it was championed by the nation's most powerful figures centuries later. In his 1900 book, The Winning of the West, Theodore Roosevelt, a man who would soon become president, gave voice to this brutal justification. He wrote, and I quote, "This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages." The language is shocking in its candor. Game preserve, as if the land's only purpose was for sport. Squalid savages, a dehumanizing slur designed to strip indigenous people of their humanity, to render their lives and their claims to their ancestral homes illegitimate. This wasn't the ranting of a fringe extremist. This was a celebrated historian and a future president of the United States, articulating the core logic of settler colonialism. For the land to be won, its original inhabitants had to be portrayed as something less than human, an obstacle to progress that needed to be cleared away. And this logic is not unique to the Americas. It is a universal blueprint for settler colonialism. The same lie of an empty or underutilized land was used by Afrikaner settlers in South Africa to justify their expansion across the Veld, claiming it as a God-given right. It echoes in the 20th century Israeli settler narrative of making the desert bloom, and the claim that Palestinian land was voluntarily abandoned rather than taken by force. The pattern is chillingly consistent. First, erase the people from the story of the land. Then, erase them from the land itself. But the numbers, the cold, hard facts, tell the true story. They dismantle the myth of the empty land with devastating clarity. In 1492, the year Columbus first landed, the Western Hemisphere was not empty. It was home to an estimated 100 million indigenous people. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Western Europe at the time was smaller, around 70 million. North of the Rio Grande alone, in the lands that would become the United States and Canada, there were at least 10 million people, living in societies that ranged from the fishing villages of the Pacific Northwest to the great agricultural confederacies of the East. Now, fast forward 4 centuries. By the year 1900, after waves of settlement, wars, and forced removals, only 200,000 to 300,000 native descendants remained alive within the borders of the United States. A population collapse of over 97%. This is a demographic catastrophe with few parallels in human history. The Spanish, the first European empire in the Americas, oversaw a particularly staggering decline. In their vast colonial territories, from Mexico to Peru, the indigenous population plummeted from an estimated 50 million to just 4 million by the late 1600s. It is tempting and convenient to attribute this solely to disease. The great dying from smallpox, measles, and influenza to which native peoples had no immunity. And while disease was indeed a horrific and powerful weapon, it was not the whole story. It was not an accident. As page 11 of our text states with chilling precision, genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. This was not a tragedy of circumstance. It was policy. The architects of this policy were not shadowy figures. They were the celebrated founding fathers and leaders of the new nation. Men like Benjamin Franklin, who in his own writings called for the extirpation of the savages to make room for the spread of the English. Or Andrew Jackson, who built his political career on Indian killing and ethnic cleansing, culminating in the infamous Trail of Tears. In the context of American history, these men were the equivalents of the 20th century's most notorious architects of genocide, the Eichmanns and Himmlers of this hemisphere. The final solution to the Indian problem was not a secret, whispered in back rooms. It was openly discussed, debated in Congress, and printed in newspapers. The threat was explicit. Even the respectable New York Times, at the turn of the 20th century, issued a stark warning to those who might stand in the way of American imperial ambition. It threatened that any opponents of the New World Order would be extinguished like the North American Indian. The genocide of native peoples was not only a historical fact, it had become a political metaphor, a warning to all who would dare resist. So we must return to the beginning, to that foundational lie. The land wasn't empty. It was full of people, of culture, of history. It was deliberately and systematically emptied, its people slaughtered, starved, and displaced, so that a new settler society could be built upon their graves and their stolen lands. This is the uncomfortable, brutal, and necessary truth that underpins the story of America. To understand the foundation of America, we must confront an uncomfortable and often obscured truth. It is a truth that redefines the very narrative of the nation's birth. The political philosopher Karl Marx, in his analysis of the burgeoning American economy, stated it with chilling bluntness. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. This wasn't hyperbole, it was a stark economic assessment. Without the immense, brutal, and entirely unpaid labor of enslaved peoples, the colonial project as we know it would have been impossible. The capital, the infrastructure, the agricultural surplus, none of it could have been generated on the scale or with the speed that it was. Slavery was not a side story or a regional flaw. It was the nation's primary and most profitable engine of growth, the very bedrock upon which the entire structure was built. Let's look north, to a place many imagine was free from slavery's stain, New York City. The reality is that African slaves literally built the city from the ground up. When it was the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company, a massive slave trading enterprise, imported the first enslaved Africans in 1626. While Dutch settlers and administrators focused on commerce and colonial life, it was this enslaved workforce that performed the backbreaking labor essential for survival and growth. They cleared the dense forests of Manhattan, laid the first roads, erected the colony's defensive fort, the very wall that would one day give Wall Street its name. They farmed the company's lands, tended the livestock, and built the homes that sheltered the colonists. The colony's early success was purchased with their sweat, their skills, and their freedom. In a rare and calculated act, the Dutch governor, Willem Kieft, eventually granted a conditional freedom, a half-freedom, to a small number of enslaved men and their families. This was not an act of conscience. The colony was embroiled in a brutal war with the local Lenape tribes, and Kieft needed a human buffer zone to protect the main settlement. He granted these freed Africans plots of land in a dangerous, undeveloped area north of the city wall. This territory, known as Het Land van de Zwarten, or the Land of the Blacks, corresponds to what is now some of the most valuable real estate in the world. Greenwich Village, Astor Place, and Herald Square. For a brief period, these families farmed their own land, a testament to their resilience. But this ownership was precarious. When the English seized the colony in 1664, they imposed new, harsher laws. The property rights of black landowners were systematically stripped away. The land, first stolen from the Lenape, was now stolen a second time from the very people whose labor had made the colony viable. Manhattan was stolen twice. While the horrors of the transatlantic African slave trade are widely known, the parallel system of Indian slavery was equally vital to the colonial economy, particularly in the South. As we see on page 13 of the text, the numbers are staggering. In the year 1708, the colony of Carolina had a population where enslaved people, both Indian and African, dramatically outnumbered European settlers. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the business model. The enslavement of indigenous peoples was a deliberate, organized, and brutally efficient enterprise that fueled the colony's expansion. The profits derived from this trade were not merely a supplement to the colonial treasury. They were its primary funding source. The entire invasion and occupation of the Carolinas was financed by capturing and selling Native Americans. Colonial authorities actively encouraged wars between tribes, rewarding their allies with trade goods in exchange for captives taken from rival nations. These captives were then marched to coastal ports like Charleston and sold. The revenue from selling human beings into the brutal sugar plantations of the West Indies or to labor-starved colonies in New England paid for the guns, the forts, and the salaries of the very soldiers who perpetuated this cycle of violence. It was a self-funding genocide. The scale of this human trafficking operation is difficult to comprehend. Between 1704 and 1710 alone, a mere 6-year window, historians estimate that at least 12,000 Indian slaves were shipped out of the single port of Charleston. This number doesn't even include those who were kept for labor within the colony, or those who died during the brutal forced marches to the coast. It was a mass deportation, a systematic depopulation of the interior to serve the economic interests of the settlers. The logic of this trade was as cruel as it was calculated. Adult men, considered the most likely to resist, escape, or lead uprisings, were often killed during the initial raids or executed afterward. Their wives and children, however, were deemed more manageable and thus more profitable. They were the primary commodities, torn from their communities and sold at auction, their families shattered forever. No one was immune, not even the families of the most powerful indigenous leaders. After the bloody conflict known as King Philip's War ended in 1676, the English colonists enacted their final revenge. Metacomet, the Wampanoag leader whom the English called King Philip, was killed and dismembered. But for his family, a different fate awaited. His own wife and 9-year-old son were captured, declared slaves by the colonial authorities, and shipped to the West Indies, sold into the living death of Caribbean sugar slavery, never to be seen again. It was a clear and brutal message. Resistance would be met not only with death, but with the complete and utter destruction of one's lineage and legacy. Page 15 of the text drives home a crucial point. This system of exploitation wasn't confined to a wealthy planter elite. It permeated every level of white settler society, implicating and benefiting nearly everyone. The New England fisherman found a ready market selling his lowest-grade refuse fish to feed the enslaved populations on Southern and Caribbean plantations. The farmer in New York or Pennsylvania grew the grain and salted the meat that supplied these same plantations, his prosperity directly linked to their operation. The shipbuilder in Massachusetts constructed the vessels for the slave trade. The distiller in Rhode Island turned molasses, a product of slave labor, into rum, a key currency used to purchase more enslaved Africans. Even a poor German immigrant, arriving with nothing, could begin his path to prosperity by renting 5 slaves to clear his land and build his farm. The entire settler economy was an intricate web, and at its center, holding it all together, was the unpaid labor of enslaved Indians and Africans. This reality dismantles one of America's most cherished founding myths. The image of the rugged, self-sufficient white pioneer, carving out a life in the wilderness through sheer grit and determination. This figure, so central to the national identity, was largely a fiction. The settler economy did not float on individual effort. It floated on a vast, stolen sea of unpaid Indian and African labor. The land was stolen, and the labor to make it profitable was stolen. The self-sufficient pioneer was, in fact, deeply dependent on a brutal system of exploitation that he, directly or indirectly, participated in and benefited from. Furthermore, as page 17 reveals, the contributions of enslaved Africans went far beyond brute force. They were the colony's skilled artisans and tradespeople. Enslaved men were the master carpenters who built the great houses of the South, the expert blacksmiths who forged tools and shod horses, the experienced river pilots who navigated treacherous waterways, and the coopers who made the barrels essential for shipping goods. Their skills were not incidental. They were foundational to the infrastructure and commerce of the colonies. Even the nation's most revered founding father was deeply enmeshed in this reality. George Washington was not just a planter who owned slaves. He actively ran a commercial construction business, leasing out his highly skilled gang of enslaved carpenters to other planters for profit. The man who would become the symbol of American liberty was, in practice, a businessman whose portfolio depended on the skilled labor of men he held in bondage. By the time of the War of Independence in 1775, the demographic result of this long history was undeniable. Africans, the vast majority of them enslaved, made up over 20% of the entire non-Indian population of the 13 colonies. This means for every 4 white settlers declaring their desire for freedom from British tyranny, there was one black person living under a far more absolute tyranny, their labor fueling the very society that denied them freedom. The paradox is staggering. The conclusion is inescapable. The emerging Euro-American nation was, in its economic structure, fundamentally parasitic. It did not create its wealth from scratch. Instead, it drew its lifeblood, its labor, its skills, its agricultural surplus, and even its land from 2 other nations existing on the same soil, the African nation and the various Indian nations. These nations were economically whole, possessing the labor, skills, and community structures for self-sufficiency. The settler nation, by contrast, was built upon the systematic draining of that wholeness. This is the foundational, uncomfortable truth of the American economy. Page 18. America became the most completely bourgeois nation in history, built from the ground up on the nightmare vision of the bourgeoisie. No feudal past, an oppressor nation from day one. Every class of Euro-American became bourgeoisified, obsessed with petty property and privileges. And crucially, America has never had its own proletariat. It imported one from Africa and chained it inside an internal colony. This is why immigration was so popular in old Europe. Young America was capitalism's real-life Disneyland. Every European who wanted land could have it, because the land had been cleared by genocide and worked by slaves. In the late 18th century, J. Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur painted a powerful and enduring image of America. He asked, "What then is the American, this new man?" His answer was a vision of transformation, a melting pot where individuals of European descent, leaving behind them all their ancient prejudices and manners, receive new ones from the new mode of life they have embraced. This new man was to be a blend of English, Scotch, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, and Swedes, forged into a single, unified identity by the fertile soil of a new continent. It was a profoundly optimistic and compelling narrative, one that promised a departure from the rigid, class-bound societies of the old world. This ideal of the plain American, unburdened by history and defined by a shared future, became a cornerstone of the nation's self-perception. But as we turn the pages of our shared history, we must ask, for whom did this crucible truly burn? The essays on pages 19 through 24 of our text confront this ideal head-on, revealing the cracks in its foundation. As the writer Lewis Lapham observes, the very notion of a singular American identity has become so fractured that today, the word often requires a qualifier, One is an African American, an Irish American, a Native American. Lapham argues this is because the original, pure, plain American ideal was a selective dream. It was a story written on a landscape already inhabited and built by hands that were never intended to share in its promise. The melting pot, it turns out, had carefully guarded gates. Crèvecoeur's vision was explicitly for Europeans. The original inhabitants of the continent, the Native Americans, were not seen as candidates for this new race of men. Instead, they were often depicted as a part of the wilderness that needed to be tamed or removed, obstacles to the manifest destiny of the new civilization. They were outsiders on their own land. Africans, brought to America in chains, were not only excluded, but were the forced labor upon which much of the nation's early economy was built. They were never invited into the melting pot. They were the fuel for its fire. And as waves of immigration continued, the crucible proved selective. The Chinese, who built the railroads that stitched the country together, were met with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Southern and Eastern Europeans, Jews and Catholics faced deep-seated prejudice and quotas. For these groups and many others, crossing the physical border of the nation was only the first step. They then encountered the symbolic and often violent borders of racism and xenophobia. Yet, despite this history of exclusion, a different reality has stubbornly, beautifully taken root. The writer Ishmael Reed rejects the melting pot metaphor entirely. He offers a more vibrant, more accurate image, a bouillabaisse. In this rich cultural stew, ingredients don't dissolve into a uniform broth. They remain distinct, contributing their unique flavor and texture to create a dish far more complex and interesting than the sum of its parts. Reed points to the America he sees every day. A Chinese woman eating pizza at a Jewish festival, a Spanish-speaking family buying Italian ices and kosher knishes, mosques thriving in Detroit, the Yoruba language spoken in Milwaukee, African art adorning the walls of a McDonald's. This, he argues, is not a recent phenomenon or a deviation from the American story. It is the story. The world has been here, Reed declares, for 10,000 years, from the continent's first peoples to its latest arrivals. The future is not a monolithic, homogeneous Western civilization. The future is what America has always been, underneath the veneer of its founding myths, a place of dynamic, chaotic, and brilliant cultural crossroads. The world is already here. This idea of distinct contributions creating a greater whole echoes through American culture. Over a century before Reed, the poet Walt Whitman heard a similar symphony. In his poem, I Hear America Singing, he celebrated the varied carols of the nation. He heard the mechanic, the carpenter, the mason, the mother, the shoemaker, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. Their individual songs, their unique labors and identities, did not melt away. Instead, they formed the powerful democratic chorus of America itself. This same spirit of cultural creation is explored by the historian Lawrence Levine in his essay on the birth of jazz. Emerging from the Black American experience, jazz was a musical revolution. It defied the rigid Eurocentric hierarchies that dominated the art world, which dictated what was high or low culture. With its improvisation, its syncopation, its raw emotion, jazz proved that profound art could rise from the margins. It demonstrated, as Levine puts it, that there are no boundary lines to art. It was a sound that could not be contained, a cultural expression that remade the rules and, in doing so, created a uniquely American art form that has since been embraced by the entire world. From Whitman's chorus, to Reed's bouillabaisse, to the improvisational genius of jazz, we see a more truthful, more inclusive vision of America, not a melting pot that erases, but a grand, unfinished symphony that harmonizes. So what is America, on pages 10 to 40? A nation built on deliberate genocide and slavery, yet also a dynamic multinational crossroads where cultures refuse to stay in boxes. The dream and the nightmare are inseparable. Bernard Malamud's story, The First 7 Years, starting page 30, will take us deeper into the human cost and hope of immigrant life in the next episode. Thanks for watching episode 2. Drop your thoughts below. Which part hit hardest? Subscribe and hit the bell for episode 3.